He won't step on the floor. Pat it here, pat it there. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't lie it up no book. You got the whole world. Anything, got the whole world. Anything, got the whole world.
Fool me once.
Anything, got the whole world.
Shame on,
Got the whole world.
shame on you. You fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Welcome to Convince Me I'm Wrong. My name is Paul Savage, and with me for comic relief is my lorikeet Pogo. We are here to tell you that it is okay to unbelieve. Changing your mind with new information is the foundation of the scientific method. I personally believe that an open and honest dialogue is the best way for us to grow as rational thinkers. I don't expect everything I say to be correct. It is just my opinion based on the facts the way I understand them. If you have a different opinion or facts that you would like to share, please join me at facebook.com/Convince Me I'm Wrong, where you can also start your own topics. Our blog is at convincemeimwrong.com. Of course, videos on YouTube, podcasts on iTunes, and you can even follow us on Twitter. Look for skeptic_logic. Thank you. Let's begin. Today we're talking about racism. I apologize, I'm still recovering from my cold, and Pogo's a little talkative right now, so hopefully she won't be too much of a distraction. But about racism, I realized that we just talked about this in my last podcast, If Blue Lives Matter to Blue Lives, which I will be re-recording and releasing on video here shortly. But just like police officers use statistics to justify their racism, I think the general public uses statistics to justify their racism as well. And I've taken some rough notes, so I'm not actually reading this. Bear with me, especially with my cold. I don't feel like I'm 100%, but I did want to get this information out there. So the statistics we're talking about, the first two that people compare are total population to public aid by percent of population. And so total population in descending order are whites, Hispanics, blacks, and then Asians. But public aid by percent of total recipients in descending order is blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and whites. Those, if the formula were simply total population equals, or percent of, total population equals percent on public aid, those would match, and they don't, and people use that to justify their racism. The other comparison people make are the number of unemployed by percent of race, and education, high school and above, by percent of race. The number of unemployed by percent of race in descending order are blacks, Hispanics, whites, and Asians. Now, education by percent of race in ascending order, so that the columns should match, are Hispanics, blacks, whites, and Asians. So Hispanics are the least educated by percent of race, and Asians are the most educated by percent of race, whereas blacks are the most unemployed by percent of race, and Asians are the most employed by percent of race. So people will use these statistics and say, see, blacks are lazy, or blacks, are working the welfare system, so on and so forth. And I think that that is actually misguided thoughts. I think that sometimes intelligent people have this way of, their confirmation bias has a way of finding in these statistics the justification for their racism. But I believe if you actually look at it and think about it, these statistics prove that racism exists and that white privilege is real. So I'm going to point out a few things that I think contribute to why these numbers are as skewed as they are. And I'm not saying that each of these are a major influence, but what I am saying is if any of these even contribute to why these numbers are skewed, then racism is real and white privilege is also real. So I want to talk about, does the lightness of one's skin determine success? I've been a photographer for about 20 years, and I've studied beauty. And I don't know that success and beauty relate to one another, but I do know that we have a preference for lighter skinned people. I read a study so long ago that I don't even remember what it was, but it's been quoted many times since, and that is that that even in darker skinned tribes, they consider lighter skinned people to be more attractive. I think if we think about this genetically, skin cancer is probably, even though it's more prevalent in lighter skin than darker skinned people, I don't believe that that was enough of a factor for our short-lived ancestors to really influence our preference. However, vitamin D production, especially moving into the cooler climates and needing to wear clothing and having shorter days during certain times of the year, I think vitamin D production would be a reason to pick people of lighter skin over people who's darker skin to mate with. If we look, well, I know that there are people out there that are saying, well, I know some very attractive people who have dark skin. And I agree with you completely because there are other factors in beauty besides the lightness of one's skin. There's symmetry, skin tone, where lightness is a value, and ratios. And these are all very, very important. But where I think our preference for lighter skin versus darker skin can come into play is that when we see someone at a distance, we know the color of their skin right away. It's one of the first things that we can tell. We can get a sense of what age they are. You know, are they an older person? Are they a child? We can even get a sense of their gender, especially depending on, you know, what clothes they're wearing. But we definitely get a sense of skin tone from a great distance. And as people get closer, then we actually are cueing in on symmetry and ratios and other skin clarity. But we don't get to see ratios and skin clarity and symmetry until someone is pretty darn close. Well, I think that can influence someone's ability to be hired is in the job interview. As soon as you walk in the door, the person interviewing you can see approximate gender, approximate age, and skin tone right out of the gate. Before you even get up to the desk, before you even get to the handshake, before they know anything else about you, assuming they haven't already read your resume, but even then, for that critical face-to-face interview, if that person is biased for light skin or against dark skin, however their bias rides, if they're biased at all, then by the time they get to the handshake, by the time you even get to talk with the person, they now need to overcome that bias. Now, how much of an influence does this really have? I think skin tone preference for aesthetic reasons is a minor influence. But if you think of the number of times that is multiplied in our society, then I think it actually becomes a moving influence. Now, if someone is biased in their hiring and firing, I think that really goes a long way to to making me think that our genetic preference for lighter skin might influence our hiring and firing. And if it does, racism is real, and it is a privilege to be white. Next, I want to talk about a name. I realize that uncommon names are becoming more common, and that my social anxiety played into an experience that I'm going to tell you, probably more than any other bias. But I've been in two situations where I was in charge of hiring and firing. One was in a kitchen or in a restaurant, and another was as an IT manager. And I realized that when I was hiring and firing in the restaurant, that I tend to choose female employees to work as servers and male employees to work in the kitchen. And when I started hiring for the IT positions, I didn't want my gender preferences to influence me at all. I didn't think that they were going to. But one of the things that I did, she's behind me muttering. One of the things that I did to try and keep myself in check is I didn't look at the names on the resumes. I just looked at the experience and education. And I came up with 3 resumes that I liked. And there was one that just rose above the rest. And when I finally looked at the name, I was mortified. There was no way I was going to be able to pronounce this name correctly. Now my social anxiety kicked in, and I didn't want to make the phone call and start our relationship from an inferior perspective of having to be corrected. And this is before cell phones. This is when you would call and ask for whoever in the household, and they would come in, or they would be called to the phone. And so you didn't know if the person that you were calling was the person that you would end up talking to. I digress. But where I'm going with this is I did eventually decide to call, and this person turned out to be female, and this person was American, but they had an Armenian name. And I couldn't help but think, were I prejudiced against foreigners in any way, shape, or form, especially against darker skinned people? The name looked to me to be like it might be someone of darker skin. So had I been that person, I might not have made the phone call. How many people do you assume don't make the phone call? Is it enough to influence the numbers? I don't know. But it is food for thought. So I'm going to come back to hiring and firing and racism in a little bit. But when I'm talking to people, I'm often confronted with people saying things like, you know, racism and slavery and all this stuff died out a long time ago. And I think that's bogus. And I'll tell you from personal experience. None of this stuff about my family am I proud of, but and how I rose beyond it, I'll never know. But as little as 40 years ago, I lived in a very ethnic community, and a black family moved in. And I remember playing catch with the boy next door, and my mother grounded me to the house because he was going to grow up, steal our stuff, and kill us. My mother's a good person. I know she's not prejudiced to that extent anymore, but I can't help but think that there's still a little bit of that thinking inside of her head. Not that she would ever act on it openly, not that she would even find value in that thinking, but it's got to influence her. And even if it no longer does, it did at some point, and that was as little as 40 years ago. My grandmother died about 25 years ago, and she was so prejudiced that when a black weatherman came on TV, she turned the volume down. She didn't even want to hear the weather from a black person. How horrible is that? And she passed away 25 years ago. That's not that long ago. Not that long ago at all. Unfortunately, I have another relative whom every single conversation we have, he brings up some sort of racist or sexist joke. Most people would consider him a really good family man. I might not even be in contact with him at this point because he's not really the kind of person I enjoy being around. If it weren't for his family drive, we're related and he wants to make sure that we stay in touch no matter what. Yet, when his sister married a black man, he quit talking to her. When I think about that, and I think about the jokes that he tells, then it seems pretty obvious that they're not just jokes. Realize I've never had a conversation with him where he did not make some sort of sexist or racist comment. And that makes me think that in his company, he must also make these comments. I can't imagine that he keeps them to himself. And that makes me think that his coworkers and his superiors must, at the very least, tolerate his behavior, and at worst, are accepting and agree with his behavior. I know that he's in a position of authority, that he has people working underneath him. I don't know what the ethnic makeup is of his subordinates, but I can't help but think that his bias, his prejudice, influences who he's going to hire and fire. And if his superiors are also as racist or even partially racist, then, how many people in that company? You know where I'm going with that. Is that enough to influence the statistics? Are there enough people like him out there in the world to skew the statistics against blacks and in favor of whites? I think that there is. I really, really think that there is. And if there is, then racism is real, and it is a privilege to be white. Now I want to flip a little bit and say there is a perceived importance to hiring a team. And so much so that a lot of companies spend a lot of money in team building exercises, workshops, and there can be no doubt that team building is critically important, especially at enterprise levels. I was speaking with a friend the other day about this, and he said that he used to be in construction and he worked for a while on an all-Hispanic crew. And that this crew tended to hire only Hispanics because they wanted that sense of team. And the only reason why he got hired and was able to stay on for as long as he did is because he's also fluent in Spanish. But he said that they rarely give white people a chance. They figure it's faster, safer, easier in the construction environment to have a team that can understand and respond and have the similar mannerisms, so on and so forth. And I can't help but think that if Hispanics are hiring their own kind, maybe blacks are hiring their own kind, and Asians are hiring their own kind, and whites are hiring their own kind. Is this all the way across the board 100%? No, of course it's not. But if there is that tendency for races to hire their own kind, since whites are the predominant race in our society, then being black is a disadvantage, and there is an advantage to being white. Now, one of the things that I was uncovering in the course of this conversation was someone mentioned speaking black to me. And I thought about Ebonics, and I know it's recognized as its own language. And it started me thinking how hard it might be to communicate with someone who's not as easy to understand as someone who speaks your own language, your own dialect. An example is I've seen study after study that shows that people perceive others with a southern accent as being less intelligent. And I can't help but think that that black speak might also be interpreted as being less intelligent. And if so, if you walk into a job interview and you're not speaking the local dialect, if you're not speaking the way the person in the interview is speaking, there has to be a bit of a disconnect. And if there's any truth to speaking differently and being perceived as less intelligent, then that has to influence the hiring and firing process. Is it enough? I don't know. But it only has to influence it a little bit for racism to be real. Now, before we talk about the problem with welfare and public aid, and I really do want to talk about welfare as an entirely different subject and the problems with it. But I realized before I started my own photography business, I was out of work for a while. A lot of people said that I was too overqualified for the jobs that they had available, and I really couldn't find anything in my area that required my skill set when I was looking. And I thought, and I want to read this list to you. I imagine that if it had been harder to find work, I imagine if I didn't have the support of my wife, if I didn't have other skills, if I didn't have the cash to start my own company, if I'd had kids, if I had been more depressed, then I might have had to give in and apply for public aid. Now that's a lot of variables, and I'm looking at this and I think, wow, I am really, really lucky. I had so many things going for me that allowed me to start my own business. Otherwise, I really might have been in public aid. About a year ago, I crushed my foot and I was entirely out of work for 6 months. Imagine if you had to go without an income for 6 months. How fast does your bank account disappear? So with our savings, with my wife's job, I had to close my studio and we had to move to a cheaper location. And that tells you how close I was to being on the street. If it weren't for our savings, if it weren't for my wife being employed, we would have had to apply for public aid. Now, the problem with public aid is getting out of public aid. I had a friend that lost her job, and she had a child, and the father was not contributing, and so she also didn't have any family in the area. So when she lost her job that had childcare, she couldn't find another job that also included childcare. So with the wage that she was making, she couldn't afford both childcare and the rest of her expenses and was forced to go on public aid. She eventually got off public aid because she met a guy who liked her enough and she was motivated enough that he helped out while she retrained and got another job. But it was really tough for her to get off aid, especially since it's you can make more money on welfare than you can on a minimum wage job. And at the time, it seemed like that's all she could get. And I look at that same thing. I'm like, when I couldn't find work, and when my business started to fold because of my disability, I really thought, wow, the only thing I can get is a minimum wage job. I might have to go on public aid. And that's a pride thing with me. I had a minimal amount of disability that I collected for those 6 months, but it didn't even pay for food. It was such a tiny amount. So I want to kind of put this together and put another perspective on it for you. If any of these things that I've said influence public aid and employment, then racism is real, and being white is an advantage. And if you are one of those who think, racism was a while ago, it's no longer relevant, I'd like to put a notion forward. Even if all of racism had died out with my grandmother's generation, all of it, let's say there was no more racial bias at all, I don't think that's been enough time to repair the damage to the black community. Think about that. Even if 25 years ago, the last racist person died, the last person influencing hiring and firing in companies had died, that's still not enough time to fix these statistics. So what is the answer? I think the answer is that we need to continue our support of minorities. And what does that mean? It means we need to fix the welfare system, topic for another day. We need to fix minimum wage, topic for another day. But we also need to do everything that we can to level the playing field when it comes to hiring people of minorities. I think as we grow as individuals and as a nation, we need to learn to not just accept minorities, but to fully incorporate them to the point in which there is no value placed on the color of one's skin. Please like this video, share it, and I would really like to hear your comments. I want to thank you for joining today. I know you probably don't agree with everything that I've said, and I don't expect you to. I would like to hear your opinions though. Join me on facebook.com/convincemeI'mWrong and the blog convincemeI'mWrong.com. You can also start your own topics on Facebook. And of course, please like and share all of our videos and podcasts. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day. Go forth and question, but question compassionately. It's okay to unbelieve. So long.